He did not mean to send it. One wrong slide over a spiderweb crack in the commune's glass, a thumb that trembled with grease and half-slept reflex. Marco Hale stared at the little blue bubble of confirmation that blinked across the screen, felt the world narrow to the size of his cramped maintenance bay. The message had been for Jory, a half-joking, half-true confession sent to the one other tech who understood how to patch a reactor and how to keep a 7-year-old from eating the plant-based paste for breakfast. You looked unreal at the safety briefing today. If anyone else knew how you make my chest do stupid things, I'd be late for every shift on purpose. Then the beep delivered. And 6 minutes later, the external airlock pings began. An arrival request, priority clearance. An unauthorized personal approach from the administration ring? Marco's welding torch sputtered in his hand. Its arc painted molten orange across his palm. He slammed the torch down on the bench, forgetting the spatter, and swiped for the external feed. There she was in the doorway frame. Outside Bay 19, not a projection or a silhouette, but the real thing. Tall and composed in a way that made cavities and panels look trivial. Commander Ailira Thane's skin was the translucent gray of river ice. Veins of pearlescent light running under the surface in irregular lattice. Her face had the kind of geometry that made architects weep. High cheek ridges. A small ridge of multifaceted bone above her brow, and 3 narrow, reflective eyes that took in the whole hangar in a single assessing breath. Where Marco had always seen a corporate name and a schedule of layoffs, Jory saw poetry. He saw things differently now. He saw a risk. Marco was 36. In the last 6 years had been a ledger of small losses that added up into a silence he could not fix. The freighter accident on the coastal lifter had taken Lysa Pilot, practical joker. The woman who had taught him to read engine temperaments like lullabies and left behind Uni, then a toddler and Marco. Suddenly a father with grease under his nails and no idea how to answer the question, when will mommy be home? He learned how to fit a bedtime story around a shift schedule. He learned how to cradle a child with one arm and tighten a pipe with the other. He learned how to silence the moments that wanted to fray. He also learned to admire Commander Thane from a distance. Ailira had risen faster than most expected. Appointment to Commodore of Auric Logistics when the company split its fleet lines. Then regional director of the relay network. She didn't make speeches so much as clarify the future. When she moved through the administration ring, time itself seemed to straighten its shoulders. Rumors haunted her that she'd cut contracts without blinking, that she ignored pleas for leniency the way some people ignored static on a radio. For Marco, she had been a bright thing he could not reach across the pulley of class and rank. He had meant the message for Jory. He had hit Ailira's icon. His thumb betrayed him. The feed showed her waiting beneath the rusted arch outside his bay. Station's wash lights picking out the crystalline ribs of her collar. Marco had moments of horrible clarity, 3, 4, 5, where he imagined his livelihood manufactured into a termination notice. An HR memo passed around executive offices, command staff whispering about unprofessional conduct. He imagined Eunice's face the morning after. Puzzled and frightened and asking why. Daddy no longer had a job. And then the airlock cycled. Jeanette, his neighbor, called out from a corridor with midnight gossip. But Marco barely heard it. Una peeked from their adjoining quarters. A mop of dark curls and an expression that could hold equal parts hope and suspicion. Is it a monster? She whispered. No, kiddo, he said too loudly. Just the boss. She had arrived without fanfare, in a way that made the entire bay feel momentarily cleaner. Ailira stepped inside, not like a human would, with slow, controlled movement, but she'd fit in the cheap plastic chair, like something designed for it. As if her long limbs folded to make room for smaller worlds. Her uniform, usually crisp and silver-threaded, was replaced by a simple wrap of woven fiber, matte and intimate against the hangar's grime. The lattice in her skin pulsed gently in the dim light. For her species, that was how they processed intensity. A slow shimmer that betrayed thought and feeling in ways humans rarely noticed. Marco scraped grease from his palms on a rag and forced a laugh that tasted like rust. Commander Thane, i.e., She raised one long-fingered hand, and the motion cut him off. Her voice did not drag across the room like a whip. It sounded like a wind chime that had been left in a canyon, strange, harmonic, and impossible to ignore. "Marco Hale," she said. "You are an anomaly." He blinked. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head in a way that made him think of a machine calibrating. "Most messages to me are transactional. Supply requests, schedule amendments, apologies after an audit. Yours carried risk." Her eyes softened in a manner he had never connected to her public presence. There was no smirk, no corporate indifference. Only something that looked very much like curiosity. He swore he could feel his ribs expand. It was a mistake. "I meant it for Jory. It was an honest misfire," she supplied. A human phrase, perhaps, that recklessness of the thumb. Lyra's whole face shifted in an expression that, to his surprise, seemed almost amused. "You called me unreal," which, when he thought of it later, had been the most terrifying moment. The moment that dismantled every plan he had made to remain unnoticed. It was the first time someone who controlled dozens of transports and a fleet's worth of lives had said, simply, "You called me unreal," and let it hang there like a loose wire. She stayed. She took the chipped mug, one he offered, and drank flat. Station-grade coffee, with the expression of someone determined to appreciate the attempt. Uni, braver in the presence of strangers than Marco ever was, edged closer and offered the only thing she carried, a handmade drawing of their family. 3 stick figures under a sky full of dots. "That's Mommy," she announced, as if reminding Marco and the world that loss could be renamed and reconciled. The night unspooled into pieces of confession. Marco told her about Lysa, the pilot. How she'd insisted on leaving a little photo of their daughter taped behind the diagnostics panel. He told Lyra about the rusted cradle of their life on the lower decks, about money stretched thin, and about the small victories that kept them breathing. Eunice nighttime giggles. The basil plants that refused to die under. Marco's unwilling care. Lyra listened with an intensity that made the scars under Marco's skin feel less like secrets. She told him about her home, a ringed world where families nested in spirals of living stone and song, and where her people, the Thuriids, wore their history in their veins. She had risen through a corporate structure that favored precision and punished softness. Emotions, she said, were considered inefficiencies. "Not always wrong ones," Marco muttered. She looked at him as if surprised by the correction. "Perhaps," she conceded. "There are types of inefficiency that produce wonder." The weeks that followed were a study in small civil rebellions. Lyra found reasons to walk the lower ring. She checked supply manifests and claimed necessity when she lingered longer than the form required. She noticed Eunice's favorite bedtime songs, the way the child hummed off-key because she could not remember all the verses. Sometimes she brought actual fruit, citrus that had the tang of old earth and tasted like a bribe in Marco's bones. She said nothing about promotions or transfers. Instead, she taught Uni a counting game with thumb and forefinger. Counting in a pattern Marco had not seen in civilian life, rumors spread like the station's mold. The commander fraternizing with a lower bay tech. The relay network's board smelled scandal where none had been manufactured. Marco felt the fingers of scrutiny brush past his shoulder. Coworkers stopped by his bay to check a panel and left the same thin smiles planted on their faces. Jory, ever loyal, tried to deflect with jokes that made Marco laugh until his mouth hurt. Then the summons came. Marco learned from a foreman rather than from Lyra herself. 3 senior officers from Auric Logistics would be on station. The next day to review operational propriety and ensure corporate governance. The board's language was clinical. Their intent was not keep a commander's life clean of romantic entanglements, or replace them if they could not. Lyra didn't flinch publicly. She did not make the sort of speeches that rallied the station. She threw herself into reviews, into arcane budget reassignments that were boring in public and brutal in impact. But Marco saw something else. A handler who had once controlled outcomes now surrendering to unpredictability in doing it every time Eunice showed up with a sticky drawing or asked questions about her mother. They will demand severance, she told him once, her pulses dimming with thought. They will ask for your reassignment, and if they find anything amiss in chain of command, they will use it. Marco thought of Uni's face, then of the night he had accidentally pressed Elira's name and the way fate had laughed at him. He understood the stakes in a way that made his throat dry. He could leave. He could accept a transfer across sectors and promise uni schools and safety. He could be practical. Instead, he handed her his resignation. He submitted it with hands that did not shake. He used the language of resignation because the board expected it to be the path of least resistance. Claim family needs. Relocate to inner colonies for schooling, additional opportunities. The personnel processor accepted the form without a second gaze. Marco left the paperwork open in his quarters and recorded a message instead, not a text. A face and voice that he knew would reach her. Elira watched the message 3 times. She watched the way Marco spoke about Uni, about not wanting to be the reason someone sacrificed everything for him. She heard the rawness in his voice, which did not soften beneath corporate polish. For the first time since she'd been promoted, she felt the world tilt. Then she did what no one expected. She resigned. It was not a spectacle. Elira's resignation came at odd hours and through channels not designed for drama. She relinquished her title, signed away authority with an efficiency that made auditors weep quietly in their offices. She stepped into a transport and followed Marco's new assignment across sectors. To a scrubbed orbital platform that smelled faintly of real coffee and actual rain, he nearly missed her at the docking concourse. He was elbow-deep in a coolant manifold when he saw her silhouette, taller and less severe than the memory. She was dressed casually, the lattice of light under her skin soft and unguarded. Uni ran ahead and flung herself at the long-limbed woman, who caught her and held her like gravity. "I've taken a great many risks in my life," Elira said later. When they'd sat in a cafe not fit for commanders or heroes. But this one felt like chipping away at a stone I did not know I had been carving for years. They were not heroic in the ways novels promised. There were no proclamations broadcast across interstellar channels. There were awkward breakfasts and Eunice's misplaced socks, and Elira's difficulty with early bedtime rituals. They disagreed about what to do with Eunice's school when the teacher suggested accelerated classes. They fought over who would replace the seal on a life support node and whether it could be done on a Saturday. But they also learned to properly laugh, until their ribs ached. Elira learned to fold herself into a space designed for 3 instead of a command staff of thousands. Marco learned how to read crowded schedules as a conversation, not an imposition. They taught each other to be honest where fear had taught them to be efficient. Not everyone forgave them. A few old colleagues from Auric Logistics wrote sharp, private memos about ethical irregularities and preferential treatment. Other people, co-workers who'd known Marco when his hands still trembled from grief, came around slowly, bringing jars of fermented preserves and a resigned good cheer. 6 months later, in a small ceremony held under a dome of cultivated sky, Marco and Elira committed to one another in a blending of rituals. Elira's people braided luminescent ribbons into the human tradition of binding hands. Uni scattered petals salvaged from a market vendor who sold flowers that were technically illegal in certain districts. Marco said vows not from a script, but from a stitched-together honesty. Elira answered in a code of her people that Marco learned to read like music. Sometimes, Elira told him later that night, the universe corrects itself with the most improbable gestures. An error, a slip, a message on the wrong channel? Marco looked down at Uni asleep in his arms, the child's breath a small metronome. He thought of Lysa and the curve of her smile, and how life had rerouted him into an existence he would choose again. Sometimes, he said, it gives you more than you expected. They built a life of small economies. Elira's skill in logistics shifted to consulting work that allowed her to be present. Marco kept his hands in machines and in soil. He coaxed basil and tomatoes from hydroponic trays that tasted like a promise. Uni learned 2 languages and how to make someone's face light up with a single word. Years later, when Uni was old enough to ask for the story in full measure, Marco would pull down the old cracked commune, the one with the spider-webbed glass. He could never bring himself to throw away and show her the message string. That had started it all. You looked unreal at the safety briefing today. He would tell her how wrong taps could change lives, how bravery sometimes looked like an accident, and how people who wore control like armor could still be vulnerable to the warmth of another hand. Elira would stand beside him, older, her lattice dimmer with age, but her eyes still catching station lights like coin. She would add, with the dry humor that Marco loved, "And don't ever assume that every message is intended for the person it is sent to. Sometimes the universe likes to prank us." Junie would roll her eyes and tuck the old commune into a drawer. Later, she would tell her friends the romantic version, with pirate ships and daring rescues and heroism. But Marco and Elira knew the truth in the quiet. A misdirected sentence, a thumb that slid on a cracked screen. In 6 minutes, 6 minutes in which a person who had everything to lose chose to arrive anyway. In the end, it had been less like fate and more like courage showing up at a maintenance bay. They had answered the knock. They had opened the door. And everything that came after, the arguments, the laughter, the small ritual of making coffee together each morning had been, in its own modest way, an answer back.